Hello and welcome back. I am Dawn Westmoreland coming from Asheville, North Carolina, the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. I've lived here almost 20 years after retiring from the Air Force. Coming from WPVM FM LP 103.7, the Voice of Asheville. Delighted to tell you I am your talk host, Dawn Westmoreland, the Empowered Whistleblower, blowing the whistles on strategies that empower people. And I'm also very excited and delighted to bring back James DeMeo, who is a retired detective, and he is an event security consultant expert. So why is that important today? Why is it so important, your role today, James?
So, Dawn, thank you so much for the opportunity to have a timely discussion. James DeMeo, based in Raleigh, North Carolina. Spent time in law enforcement, as you've mentioned, retired into the private sector, focusing on event security, safeguarding stadiums, venues, and arenas. So, in light of the global threat continuum, we're seeing domestically and internationally the need for obviously safeguarding large groups of people in densely populated spaces. And we look at obviously the emerging risks, whether that's cybersecurity, whether that's the active assailant, the insider threat, just a multitude of challenges that are facing today's event security organizers.
I mean, do people like Taylor Swift need you?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think so. And, obviously, she had concerts in Vienna, Austria that were canceled based on credible threats. So that was certainly a big win for the sports security, the international intelligence community. That was a win. And obviously, she recently performed over in New Orleans for 3 days. So thankfully, everything went well there. But lessons learned from Vienna, as well as what happened in New Orleans, she was able to bring in $250 million over 3 shows in New Orleans. So
Mm.
certainly an international mega superstar, the need for obviously robust security initiatives and understanding the risks that are associated with safeguarding these spaces. Obviously, Taylor Swift, obviously the Super Bowl, the need to kind of get out in front of these emerging challenges is paramount during this age of disruption.
James, people may not be familiar with Taylor Swift's episode of what happened, the experience. Can we go into detail a little bit about that? What happened? Why did she not perform?
So, based on credible threats that
Mhm.
security officials had received in Vienna, Austria, again, the international intelligence community, with timely information sharing, decided to err on the side of caution, out of abundance of caution, to cancel her concerts. And again, these were credible threats, and
Mhm.
certainly that was the right call. And we've seen down the road, obviously, if organizations don't, and again, that's federal, state, local, private entities, if they're not availing themselves of these resources and making these decisions in a timely manner, certainly there's just evolving risks that can face the venue ownership groups.
Well, what's going to stop some nut job from threatening every person out there that wants to have an event? I mean, could this happen again to other people, whether they're a celebrity or a politician or just a popular person?
Well, we live in a very troubled world. So we have social media and we have the bad actors that study our playbooks. And so as we do the good things, the nefarious bad actors are studying the things that we do to prevent them from creating these chaotic situations within stadiums, venues, and arenas. So it's certainly work that I'm passionate about. I've been, in security, law enforcement, well over 30, 35 years,
Wow.
transitioning into higher education and teaching both on the graduate and undergraduate levels for a few universities. But the workforce development piece, and basically letting the students know how important it is to understand all these evolving risks, that are within facilities and cyber IT and obviously, with errant and rogue drones and just a multitude of challenges and understanding that, these young individuals, once they graduate from the university, are going to go out and keep our respective families safe while attending live, concerts and sporting events. So again, an area of passion for me as well.
Now, we hear in the news all the time about people suing whoever's in charge of the event because there was a gunman there who shot up people. And now people are going into litigation more than ever. And I know one thing, from my work and your work, that a lot of times people are reactive and think, oh, it'll never happen to me. This will never happen to me. But obviously it does happen.
It does happen, and today's sports and entertainment industry is a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut. But with that, with all the money that's made, which is wonderful, it's NIL, the portal, Obviously, streaming and venue naming rights, all those things are wonderful, but no venue wants to be known as that venue where something tragically happens. So, as you've mentioned, 6 months down the road, if there's an incident, there's some kind of tort, some kind of civil law, obviously, where there's a notice of claim. And we've seen that obviously with the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Brian Stowe case. We've seen obviously the
Mhm.
economic implications of the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing. We've seen that obviously with crowd management scenarios with Travis Scott and Astroworld. So lessons learned. Again, no venue wants to be known as cutting corners or skimping on robust security initiatives, but again, the importance of being proactive is paramount to reactionary measures. Again, no organization wants to have to explain while they're not listening to a podcast like this, while they're not availing the most current and robust training for their event security and their guest services to ensure that law enforcement has walked through the venue. They've done, the red teams and obviously the computer simulations and the tabletops and all those things that are so important to understand the physical layouts of the venue, because what we do in practice, Dawn, obviously, is how we're going to react in a true crisis situation.
Yeah. Now, I've often heard people want security, they want the knowledge, they want the strategies, but they don't have the money. What if somebody is a small, they're a small event, but they want more security? How do they deal with that? That they just don't have a lot of money for security?
Well, they certainly have to, create you know, robust relationships, listen to podcasts like this, obviously, but avail themselves of their governmental stakeholder partners, meaning federal, state, and local, have a great relationship with the local law enforcement agency, invite them down to the venue, properly vet their volunteers. And obviously, there's a wealth of information that's out there in terms of event security training. So it's, lifelong learning. And as I mentioned earlier, the workforce development piece, but there are resources out there. Just reach out to leaders in the space, avail yourself of being that venue that is asking for that help, that understands that you don't have, the resources available to you, but to kind of get out in front of that by surrounding yourself with the resources that can provide that value for you, for your organization.
Now, as you mentioned, 35 years background experience, that's a lot of experience. Now, you've written a book. Would you tell the audience about your book and what they would get out of your book?
So thank you for bringing that up. It's called "What's Your Plan?" It's a step-by-step guide to keep your family safe during emergency situations. I wrote it back in 2017, based on a personal experience I had with my family while visiting a mall in Durham, North Carolina. So the lights went out, and I was with my son, my family, and he said something to me. The little hairs on the back of my neck went up, and from that moment forward, we, on the way home, we had a conversation on what we would do as a family. In the event we were faced with a true emergency situation. So I wrote the book based on what my son said to me, and I broke the book down into certain chapters: what you would do at your place of worship, what you would do obviously at a sporting venue, what you would do obviously in a corporate center. And that's 2017. So here we are in near Thanksgiving, 7 years later. What's happened in the world? We came out of the worst pandemic. Obviously, it's just a very, very difficult situation. So as we're transitioning back into being live and in person, whether that's at work, we're getting away from hybrid work from home, we're attending sporting events, doesn't mean that those challenges went away. They're even more pronounced in terms of cyber and what's happening in the world. So I always tell families to have that conversation, look at the chapters within the book. There's a checklist at the end of each chapter to kind of review what works for you. So what works for your family, Dawn, may be different than mine. But when the DeMeo family goes out, we have fully charged cell phones. If we're going to the mall, we already know where we're going to meet in the event we're separated. So we have a predetermined, meeting place, a unique code word for our family. We remember where our car is parked at the mall, as an example. But I always say, being in law enforcement, I know firsthand, good ladies and gentlemen in law enforcement, they do the best they can. But unfortunately, we've seen with these active shooter situations that most of the bad stuff is over before they get on scene. So what will you do as a family to survive the unthinkable before law enforcement, gets to the scene and helps you? And I always say always follow their direction and guidance, but it's surviving those first crucial minutes before they get on scene to kind of take over that situation. So, understanding what's important, getting out in front, and ensuring your personal safety during times of disruption.
I think that's wonderful advice, James. I don't know how many years ago, maybe it's been 10. I just happened to be at a flea market in South Asheville, And all of a sudden I hear bang, bang. And, I'm retired from the Air Force, so I'm really on high alert. I'm thinking, what the heck? And the short story is he's a young man who's been now put in prison for forever with no parole, had shot another man over, tools. They were both selling tools, and I think the other guy was selling tools cheaper and getting more clients. And the first thing I'm thinking is go back to my military training, everything I've been taught. Where am I going to go? Where am I run? Who am I going to call? What am I going to do? So I think strategies are very important. I mean, the police handle it so well, and it was over with quickly, but unfortunately the man did pass away. So having strategies at any time, you just never think that that would happen.
Yeah, especially with event security, I always say an educated fan is a safe fan. So before you get out to the venue, to read the codes of conduct, to follow the mantras of, run, hide, fight, see something, say something, but just really be situationally aware of what's going on around in the world at all times, and understanding that obviously, the book wasn't written to instill fear, but actually to empower families to get out in front based on, knowledge and training and education and understanding of what they could do to place themselves in the best position possible to survive the unthinkable. So whether it's a venue, whether it's a place of worship, whether it's a corporate center, whether it's, as I mentioned, a shopping mall, to have that conversation, to know exactly what you're going to do, prepares you to best face the unthinkable.
Yeah. And James, let's talk about a sensitive subject, politics. No matter who's in the office, it doesn't matter. Right now we've had some scary events of people being shot at. What do you think about that? How can we reduce that as a nation, no
Well,
matter
yeah,
who's in charge?
yeah. I mean, you bring up a great point, and certainly coming out of a contentious political cycle, I teach my students all the time about geopolitics, what's happening in the world, what's happening domestically, what's happening in the Middle East, and how do you provide for robust security within these spaces based on what's happening in the world. So certainly an assassination attempt, a special event, but understanding that these things happen, and unfortunately they may continue to happen. But we go back to the risk assessments, Dawn, we go back to the training, we go back to, ASIS International talks about enterprise risk security management. It's kind of looking at things holistically from the inside out, the outside in. In security, we talk about concentric circles of security. They also talk about crime prevention through environmental design, which is really, just aesthetically pleasing event security, meaning landscaping, lighting. So all these things that we can implement within these spaces in light of, as you've mentioned, geopolitics, whether there's a protest. So if you're in the command center of a $1 billion building, if you're at the Barclays Center building I opened several years ago, and now you're responsible, law enforcement's responsibly monitoring social media on what's being posted pre, during and post event, to understand that you could have a crowd of protesters right outside your venue as fans are leaving, mindful that they may have been drinking alcohol for 3 or 4 hours. And now you have not only one situation, but maybe, simultaneous security threats. Someone pulls the fire alarm. There's a fire in the subway, there's an errant drone, and now fans are intoxicated leaving the venue, and they're going into a protest. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just one specific challenge. It could be a multitude of challenges. So how will you manage that in terms of risk management? How will you lead people to safety as they're egressing, as they're leaving the venue, going into a mass transit hub? We saw with the Olympics that the arsonists found 3 out of 4 mass transit hubs with fires. So that presented to the world that it was a unsafe event before it even happened. So the bad actors look at that. They look to exploit those soft targets on the outside of venues, again, that fall into smart cities and watch parties in business improvement districts. But again, we have lots of interchangeable parts in event security. So it's keeping fans safe as they come in and adhering to that duty of care from the time the ticket is scanned to the time they leave the venue. What are you doing from a venue ownership group to ensure that fans are safe, while they're at the venue?
James, do we have a responsibility, if we're going to an event, whether it's a concert to see Taylor Swift, or we're going to the, NFL or something like that? Do we have a responsibility as individuals for our safety?
Yeah, obviously duty of care. That duty of care, as I've mentioned, falls back to the venue ownership group. The entity that owns the building as you're going in to the event. However, the fans can play a proactive role in their own personal safety and situational awareness by taking the time, as I mentioned earlier, fully charged cell phones, having that, pre-event conversation, as they're driving in their auto or they're taking Lyft or Uber to or from, to know exactly what they can do to ensure their own personal safety. So I always say, I said it earlier, but an educated fan is a safe fan. So if you're sitting in a venue with 40,000, or 80,000 people at a football game, and you have a smartphone, use it to your advantage. Send that text to the command center that something's happening in section 101. Let the
Mhm.
folks that are trained to keep you safe come out and look at that potential brawl, that potential, risk scenario. But again, utilize those technologies to keep you safe while you're out at the venue.
I like that. I like that very much. When people reach out to you and you work with them, the different clients, what are some of their pain points that they're going through? Why
So
are they?
everybody, yeah, I mean, I always say what keeps the venue owners up at night, but whether it's the Super Bowl, which has, obviously what they call Tier 1 security, it's, the creme de la creme, the top security you could imagine, as opposed to, K through 12 high school football that has the opposite, where they may not have all those resources, right, of the federal government. Everybody comes into sports security and understanding the needs, for safeguarding these spaces in a different place. Some people have, your training, my training, and other people are part-time security officers that are college students or volunteers that don't really know a lot about security, but are very interested in event security and want to know more about it. So understanding where they're coming from, understanding what their level of training is, understanding what the needs are for the venue ownership group, and kind of, assessing what can we do to keep everyone safe, make sure everyone's on the same page, speaking the same language in the interest of public safety is so crucial during these times.
I love stories, and you're a good storyteller too. I'd love to hear a story about somebody you've helped. You don't have to say their company or their name if it's, private, but how have you helped somebody succeed? I'd love to hear a good story.
Yeah, I mean, storytelling as a teacher is really instrumental in empowering my students. So it's one thing when they learn from the textbook. It's one thing if I show them the research or the after action or the case studies. But it's another thing if I actually say I opened $1 billion building and this is what happened the first night of the grand opening of the Barclays Center, as an example. And this is what happened a few nights later, and understanding the different types of crowds that come. So, my what I do to empower is just educate. Just see where they're coming from, what their pain points are, trying to create value for them, but trying to, get them to talk about themselves. What are they interested in? What keeps them,
Mhm.
up at night? What are their concerns? I'll ask my students, how were you treated the last time you went to a concert? Was the staff professional? Did they engage with you? Did you feel safe? And then kind of getting that feedback and having discussions on, well, let's create this scenario-based learning, as an example of what they would do. And that really reinforces not only textbook but research and case studies, as I've mentioned, but integrating storytelling based on my experiences, sharing stories of working at $1 billion building or a mid-sized venue, and just being a leader that understands that maybe there was a threat at another venue, but doing the research before that event to say, hey, staff, listen, this is what I just found. This happened in Houston, and this performer is coming to our venue tonight. Let's be on the lookout for this, as an example. So I think it's important to have those conversations, between venue ownership groups, between event security at different venues as well, but the staff, and just empowering, individuals that want to go into these types of conversations for career opportunities. I think it's a field that's going to continue to grow. It's going to garner global implications, and it's going to continue to evolve just based on, the monetary volume of money that's going into this space.
Mhm. And from your experience, James, the people who do bad acts, whether it's shooting, violence, do they tend to be more men or women, and why?
Well, full transparency, I'm not an active shooter expert, if you will, but they talk about, obviously the copycat contagion, meaning if there is an active shooter situation, typically 13 days later, the chances of a repeat scenario significantly increase. So when you talk to people that are really experts in this, they'll talk about copycat contagion. And the bad actors, as I said, will study our playbooks. So we look at the Las Vegas shooter. That individual did reconnaissance. They went to several different venues before they went to obviously Mandalay Bay and Las Vegas, and that was considered unprecedented in sports security. A bad actor shooting down into a confined space of concert goers, 32 floors up, never had happened before. But the bad actor in that case, he had conducted reconnaissance. So as people look at this conversation, the good actors will learn from it, and the bad actors may study, unfortunately, what we put out in the open domain. They'll study our playbooks to try to use the knowledge that we're sharing with them against us. So we have to understand that with the internet, that obviously we want our intentions to be good, but the bad actors, whether that's the insider threat, domestic extremism, domestic terrorism, as I mentioned, geopolitical divisiveness, the bad actors could potentially be studying what we're putting out there in the public space to use that against us, obviously.
And with your background and your doing and other people, in your career field, what is your opinion? Is it going to get worse, as far as people disrupting events, causing problems, being violent? Is it going to get worse? Is that the trend, or is it going to stay same, or is it going to decrease?
It's a great question, and I try to not be a fear monger, right? If I want people to listen to me, and it's a great question, I appreciate you asking it. But if I want to really make an impact in the world, I have to get people. Well, first I have to see what their interests are, but then I have to get them to kind of listen what I'm evangelizing, meaning the knowledge, the training, the risk assessments. So to answer your question, these are difficult times. We're coming out of a contentious political cycle. We're transitioning to a new administration, but the threats are not going away anytime soon. Anytime we have large groups of people in condensed areas, there's always a multitude of threats that could potentially be exposed. So I ask my students to do a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths? What are the
Yeah.
weaknesses? Look at the after actions, but also that information sharing. So we're only as good as the information and the research that we have, but we have to share it, the knowledge, in a timely manner. So it's a tough question to answer because we really don't know, but we want to, rely on our training, our knowledge, and to be proactive so that if we're doing the best we can, Dawn, with the resources we have, if we're conducting the research, if we're utilizing the technologies, inside venues, you have, obviously license plate reader technologies, responsible social media monitoring, biometrics, iris scans. Those technologies are there for a reason. It's to keep people safe, to move them in, because those bad actors, on the exterior perimeters will look to take advantages of crowds together. And so as event security, we want to move people in safely, but we also don't want to lower the level of security by letting bad actors in to the venue with prohibited items. So we have to find that balance of educating without being overzealous and creating a police state, because again, it is all about the fan experience. So yeah, the threats will continue just based on, the evolving threat continuum. But I always say that, we do the best we can. And, with our training, knowledge, and education, we want to create kind of a proactive mindset to mitigating, all types of risks within multiple security verticals.
Mhm. James, who's your ideal client to work with?
Ideal client would be, obviously a stadium, venue, arena,
Mhm.
whether that's obviously a $1 billion building, a mid-sized venue, K through 12. And again, but that could be applied across multiple verticals because of special events, a high school football game. It could be, a special event at a corporate entity. But, reaching out to those clients and saying, what are your concerns? What happened recently that you can share with me that maybe didn't go as well as you thought it would? And what can we do to kind of look at all the risks within your space to improve upon, your level of training? Who trained you? Was it James DeMeo? Was it Dawn? What's their level of training?
Mhm.
When was the last time you did a risk assessment? What metrics are you using to measure the training that you're sharing with staff so that they understand what you're teaching them, so that they can apply that training to keep people safe? So lots of conversations, but first and foremost, just asking them, how are things going? What's keeping you up at night? Where do you see areas of improvement? What things in the event security space don't you understand? And allow me, or afford me, the opportunity to explain them to you, to the best of my ability, to create, value as someone who could potentially be involved in a project.
What are some of the weaknesses people come forward with when they work with you and they say, okay, between the two of you, you collaborate, you talk, you build a relationship with the person, and you get to know his or her pain points. But what are some of the weaknesses that you have discovered and able to help them with?
What I'm hearing in event security is, two things. Venue owners are concerned about crowd management, as I mentioned earlier. Astroworld, Travis Scott, Boston Marathon bombing, Las Vegas shooting massacre. Copa 2024 in South Miami. Thankfully, that was a tragedy averted. Could have been a disaster of epic proportions. Obviously, what happened over in the UK several years ago. With obviously the Ariana Grande concert, IED bomber on exterior perimeter. Folks that are in venues are concerned about lots of people moving into the venue. How do you get them in safely without lowering the standards of, event security, the magnetometers, the screening, all those things, the prohibited items, not getting into the venues, but also the cyber ecosystem. What happens when a bad actor infiltrates the mainframe? Lights went out in the Super Bowl several years ago in New Orleans. The leads in the command center thought initially for a brief moment it was a cyber terrorism attack. Thankfully, it wasn't that. It was a bad feed from an energy provider, but we don't know that, right, Dawn? So
Yeah.
cybersecurity is something that is on the minds of venue ownership groups. Again, for staff, it could be players' contracts, it could be vendors, all that sensitive proprietary information. The fans are, scanning their apps, so they have sensitive information that they're sharing with the venue, but a third party provider loses that to a bad actor. Now it's on, the black market as an example. Your information, my information.
Right.
Ticketmaster, when you go and you buy your tickets through Ticketmaster, and let's say there is some kind of ransomware or a cyber breach. Now your personal credit card information, your information is exposed potentially. So those are things that I'm hearing about. Those are pain points. Crowd management, crowd crush, stampedes, moving fans in and out, obviously ingressing into, as I mentioned earlier, mass transit hubs and smart cities and business improvement districts, as well as the insider threat, cyber terrorism, as someone gaining access to access control and CC television and knocking out all the cameras nefariously, and then locking fans in the stadium, pulling the fire alarm
Mm.
while dispersing an errant drone with a chemical, radiological, biological agent. So there's lots of different scenarios that they're talking about, that they're planning for, but certainly, ensuring that they're providing, resources in those areas, as I've mentioned, crowd management, crowd control, as well as cyber, is key for safeguarding these types of challenges.
James, we're about to wrap up. Time goes by so quick, but I am just wanting to know this. The bad actors out there, you say they're studying how to get ahead, to do bad actions. How do people like you get ahead of the bad people?
Well, this conversation, right? We're reaching a listening audience, and they're just processing and absorbing what we're saying, right? The following the flow of the conversation. I'm sure you'll share some links, for resources. They want to connect with me. That's wonderful. But as I've mentioned, we work diligently. I work in higher ed, so it's, after actions and case studies and lessons learned and the sharing of best practices and information sharing from, the Joint Terrorism Task Force to contract security, which is a form of, risk transfer and third-party risk management. But we look at the Super Bowl and they have all the resources in the world, but what happens? So every year, invariably, a fan gets on the field. So no one bats 1,000, whether you're the Super Bowl, whether you're a mid-sized venue, whether you're a smaller performing arts center. They had the Ottawa truckers protesting a couple of years ago. So I used that case, a makeshift case study that, well, if you were in a performing arts center in Ottawa and there was a national trucking protesting going on right outside your venue, what would you do? If you weren't monitoring that in real time, would you shelter in place? Would you evacuate? What steps would you take not to create a sense of panic, whether it's 3,000 fans, and again, it's understanding, is it a performing arts center? Is it 80,000 fans at Division I college football? But, my thing is just about kind of getting out in front, having these conversations, aligning, obviously governmental stakeholders, the private sector, as well as groups like ASIS International.
Right.
One of the groups that I go to all the time is the National Center for Spectator Sports Safety and Security, NCS4, with Dr. Hall at Southern Mississippi. So my role in higher ed, these conversations, reaching out to the venue ownership groups, asking them, what their pain points are, what keeps them up at night, and then just having a conversation like we are now.
Yeah.
Let's figure out how to get out in front of this so you're not known as that venue, unfortunately, that's facing, this type of litigation that really should have spoken with Dawn and James 6 months ago. as an example.
And
But there's a
Chair,
lots. Yep.
we're running out of time. Let me
Yep.
get your contact information.
Absolutely. So obviously, James A. DeMeo, I'm on LinkedIn, and event security expert. Again, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on social media. Google all things sports security, and hopefully you'll see my name pop to the top because I'm somebody who's trying to add content, someone who's trying to create groups. I have a private group called Sports Security Professionals, and as I've mentioned on LinkedIn. So again, I'm someone who's just trying to share a passion. Prior law enforcement, love sports. This is where I feel I should be today and moving forward. Certainly higher education, but thank you so much for this opportunity to have a timely discussion. Appreciate it.
Listeners, we'll see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dawn. Take care.